So with Kenobi right around the corner, and inevitably a closer look at the early days of the Galactic Empire, I figured now was a good time to take a closer look at exactly why the Empire would abandon a lot of the relatively effective military equipment utilized by the Republic before the transition. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoy this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So, we're all familiar with the military equipment utilized by the Republic during the Clone Wars. The iconic Venator-class Star Destroyer, the LAAT gunships, the clone troopers themselves, they would all become synonymous with that era in galactic history. The clone troopers were such a remarkably effective fighting force that they were easily able to put down a droid army several times their size and claim victory on nearly every major battlefield, especially during the later days of the war when they became more experienced in combat. And their equipment was remarkably reliable and successful. Things like the AT-TE would become a menacing threat on the battlefield to any force that opposed it. The LAAT gunship was remarkably adaptable and could airdrop troops into very specific locations, being able to defend the landing zone themselves using their own weapons. And the Republic Navy would field the Venator-class Star Destroyer, a very capable carrier battleship hybrid that was honestly almost perfectly designed to engage an enemy that was heavily dependent on starfighters like the CIS or the later Rebel Alliance. However, the Galactic Empire that succeeded the Republic seems to have slipped up and ultimately taken a downgrade in nearly every one of these categories. While these stormtroopers of the Imperial military were still very capable soldiers, they couldn't compare to the combat abilities of the clones during the war. The AT-ATs that the Empire replaced the AT-TE with was much larger on the battlefield, but that made it harder to utilize cover in that vehicle. The Empire would ultimately replace the LAAT with the Sentinel-Class landing craft, a craft that is far less armed, much larger and bulkier, but could ultimately carry a larger number of troops, albeit defending them fairly poorly while they're disembarking the vehicle. And they would replace the Venator-class Star Destroyer, a vessel made almost specifically for swatting down enemy starfighters, with the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, a vessel teeming with turbo lasers and interestingly completely lacking a point defense system in its first iteration. Why would the Empire make these changes? Almost all of them seem to be changes for the worse that made their military less effective in combat. Arguably, if the Empire was still fielding the equipment and troops used during the Clone Wars, they maybe could have won the Galactic Civil War. Disregarding the plot armor aspects of this, let's talk from a practical standpoint about the decisions the Empire made, starting with the biggest one that is fairly widespread, and that's imagery. A lot of the icons of the Clone Wars were just that, icons. Very visual representations of the Galactic Republic and its struggle against the Confederacy of Independent Systems, its struggle against tyranny. The Empire wanted to very clearly distinguish themselves from the government that had come before. The idea that the Empire was something completely different needed to be hammered into the heads of the people of the galaxy, and the easiest way of doing that was to make your forces very distinctively different from that of the Republic. As such, the things that were very visually iconic to the Republic, especially during those later days of the Republic's reign, were earmarked to be removed. That's things like the clone troopers, the LAATs, and the Venators, all of which were icons of the Republic. But those weren't the only reasons. Let's talk about the shift in doctrine. The Republic during the Clone Wars was fighting a fairly straightforward stand-up war against a faction that they were actually fairly evenly matched against. The Galactic Empire was trying to have basically a very large police force to strike fear into the hearts of the galaxy, following something called the Tarkin Doctrine, which was adopted very early on in the reign of the Empire. The Tarkin Doctrine called for the Imperial military to be basically built around the idea of striking fear into the hearts of the people of the galaxy, and doing so required having the scariest looking military. And that's why things like the Imperial-class Star Destroyer would come into being. While they may not be as effective against light starfighters, a weapon commonly used by the Rebel Alliance, they would have been able to easily stomp any capital ships, and their presence as a battleship bristling with guns was very intimidating when you just needed a vessel with a high intimidation factor. Moving on to the LAAT. While it was a very effective dropship and a very effective gunship, it could only deploy a relatively small number of troops compared to the Sentinel-Class landing craft, which, well, they couldn't deploy in quite the same combat state as the LAAT, with guns blazing clearing out a landing zone. They could instantly deploy enough troops to easily overwhelm any enemy, which is a very remarkably intimidating capability for a military to have. It is a similar situation with the ATTE. While the short, squat Republic Walker may have been pretty effective in combat, they didn't have the intimidation factor that the walking skyscraper that is the AT-AT had. The mere appearance of an AT-AT on the battlefield was often enough to force an enemy to surrender, seeing that behemoth towering over the field of battle. And the last factor that played into this is cost. Ultimately, raising a clone from birth, even with the accelerated life cycle of the clone troopers, was an expensive task. And training them for military combat from their earliest days, while it did lead to very effective soldiers, was ultimately very expensive. Maintaining the clone army nearly bankrupted the Republic during the Clone Wars, and the Empire wanted a much larger force. And on top of that, the Empire really wasn't expecting to fight a stand-up war, thinking they would have a better grip on the galaxy than the Republic. As such, they opted for the less capable, but cheaper to manufacture, if you will, conscripted soldiers and recruits that would form the Stormtrooper Corps. But ultimately, all of this would come back to bite the Empire during the Galactic Civil War, where they would end up facing the Rebel Alliance, an adversary that functions fairly similar to the Confederacy of Independent Systems, with a heavy reliance on starfighters and quick hit-and-run attacks. These are tactics that arguably the Republic Navy would have been better suited to face off against than that of the Galactic Empire. If you'd like to learn about why the Venator-class Star Destroyer was so perfect for countering tactics like this, I'll leave a link up here to my video on why the Venator was such a great fit for the Republic during the Clone Wars. And I want you to let me know down in the comments, if you could keep one piece of Republic military equipment in service with the Galactic Empire, which piece would you choose? Would it be the LAAT or the Venator, or the ATTE or the Clone Troopers themselves? And last but not least, if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, leave it down below in the comments. And last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.